Good evening, viewers. I have an interesting and perhaps a worrying story to share with you today. There is some building concern about the defense budgets in India. Now, don't get me wrong, India is not a small spender on defense. We are, in fact, the number 5 spender on defense in the entire world after the US, China, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and then comes India with $52.5 billion US dollars that we spend every year. Now that makes us ahead of the UK, France and Germany when spending on defense. But to spend approximately a third of what China's total defense budget is right now should be worrying, given the immediate threat that China perhaps poses. Like I said, there have been several reports that have come out lately, and let's take, for example, what's happening with the army. Now, the army has a total annual budget this year at least of 1,53,875 crore rupees, and that money is spent largely on salaries. 63% of that money goes into salaries, 20% into maintenance and operations, 3% into infrastructure, and 14% on modernization. Now, here's where the problem begins to arise. According to a representative of the army, the allocation to modernization this year is, and I quote, grossly inadequate because it needs to be at least 22 to 25% or we will be found wanting. Now, there have been a series of reports pointing to budget deficits in our armed forces, but these reports are normally completely ignored by the politicians who run this country. The same people who asked for these reports in the first place. Now, the equipment within the Indian Army falls into 3 categories, and this is interesting. Vintage, which is about 30-odd years old, current, and state-of-the-art. Now, there should be a split of a third to each, but we've learned that vintage, which is the really old equipment, is 68% of the equipment that our army has. 24% is current, and only 8% is state-of-the-art. And that's where the equipment is right now. Now, our Finance Minister Arun Jaitley could be called a very generous man because if you remember in our budget in February, he hiked the budget for the defense by 7.81%. Again, we need to ask, is it enough? An increase of 7.8%, according to representatives of the army, gets largely chewed up by salary increases under the 7th Pay Commission. And it doesn't even cater for inflation under operations and maintenance. The Parliamentary Committee has placed a report before the Parliament. And in that report, it basically said that the army had asked for an allocation, and what the government actually gave the army had a 23% deficit. The army itself has been quoted saying this to Parliament, that the current budget is not supportive of the inevitable needs of the army. In fact, the report notes, and this is the army speaking to the government, the report notes that China has become increasingly assertive, that modernization in both Pakistan and China is going on full swing, that China is competing to reach the levels of US. And as a country, should that worry us? Should China actually worry us? Let's take a look at some comparisons between China and India. The defense budget in China is 4 times the defense budget in India. According to a report by the International Institute of Strategic Studies, China increased its spending on defense in 2016-17 by 25%. In the same year, India increased its spending by 2.4%. The army in China has 600,000 more active soldiers than India does. China has 1,200 tactical aircrafts, while India has a little over 700. China has 55 more cruisers, destroyers and frigaters than India does. Altogether, the Parliamentary Committee on Defence has called this an agonizing state of affairs. Should we also be agonized? Admiral Arun Prakash, the former chief of the Indian Navy, has said that India faces serious shortages in its defence planning system. It's highly slow and inefficient, and that all of the unspent money lapses. He says, and I quote, a large portion of the defense budget is spent on revenue, like salaries, and very little is spent on modernization and re-equipment. How all these issues are actually affecting the Indian Army, Navy, and Air Force actually can be boiled down to basic categories. In the army, for example, the army has said they have trouble procuring equipment. They have trouble right now constructing strategic roads near the Sino-India border, which is something that needs to happen immediately, but there isn't enough money. For the Navy, procurement of ammunition and spares and serviceability of ships, submarines and aircraft turns out to be a problem because they're trying to keep up with aging infrastructure. And in the Air Force, there's an inability to procure spares, an inability to procure fuel. Maintenance and training of the fleet and serviceability is also effective. Now, this is not the first report, and it's unlikely to be the last. Most of these reports lie unattended in the dusty cabinets of the government offices. But at the same time, remember, our soldiers are at the border. We're having air crashes on a regular basis because of technical failures in aircraft. This is a battle or a question that comes up for every government. It's guns versus butter. Or put simply, how much should we actually spend on defense? Given the fact that so many people in our country are going hungry, a third of our population are going hungry, should we be spending on defense or should we be spending on food? Are our armed forces being neglected by our government? To give you a quick statistic, we spend a little over 1.5% right now on defense, 1.5% of our total GDP. This is perhaps a low number, given that it used to be higher than 3% at one point. Now, this is not a subject for debate. This is a subject we need to understand. So at Mirror Now today, we've taken a great deal of trouble to put together a panel that will help us all understand how difficult this problem really is, and if it needs the attention of the citizens and the government of India.